welcome to Allander. It's a tiny town in eastern North Carolina. 28 years ago, almost to the day from when I'm recording this, just a few hundred feet behind me, a man by the name of Alan Jenkins was found dead in his home, having suffered 2 shotgun blasts to the chest. This is a very small town. A lot of people would say that it's the kind of place where the modern world has kind of passed it by, and that's undoubtedly true. A lot of the people here would say that's just fine with them, that they're happy to kind of have a slower pace of life where there's not a whole lot of change. The downtown here hasn't had a lot added to it. There's been a few things taken away from it, as we'll see. This is the kind of town where everybody kind of knows everybody else. The families that live here have lived here a very long time and will probably continue to live here for a very long time. The Jenkins family is no exception. Alan Jenkins was actually living in his mom's old house at the time when he was murdered. His brother owned property here in town, including a junkyard on the other end of the street. His neighbors knew Alan Jenkins and kind of had a feel for his comings and goings. I guess they probably considered him a good neighbor in some ways and bad in others. He was a good neighbor because he could be counted on to mow his lawn once or twice a week and keep the exterior up. He was a bad neighbor in the sense that on Friday, Saturday nights, he might have parties that went deep into the early morning hours of the next day. He liked fish, especially fresh fish. This is a good place to want that because there's a lot of great fishing around here. But he also had a weakness for underage teenage girls that got him in trouble with the law on at least one occasion. Jenkins was almost certainly planning that kind of a get-together on the day or night that he was murdered. He had the heat on in the house. Maybe it was at night and he was trying to keep the house warm. It was probably close to 80 degrees in the house when he was murdered. He was wearing only a towel. Somebody had taken Jenkins' shotgun and come into his bedroom to confront him, shot him twice in the chest. Several of the pellets from the shots actually penetrated all the way through his body. There was blood spatter around the room as well. Alan Jenkins' body wasn't found immediately. There was some gap of days between when he died and when the body was found. Eventually his brother, who, as I mentioned, lived here in town, became worried about his brother and went to the house. And he found what for him must have been a horrific scene. The house was, as he said, about 90 degrees. There was a foul stench in the house. He found his brother's body, as I said, shot twice in the chest. There was bloat for the body. The arms were mottled. There were maggots on the body, substantial numbers of maggots on the body. And Alan Jenkins' body was not found right away. There were several days at least between when he was killed and when the body was found. I mentioned that his brother lived here in town. Eventually his brother became worried about Alan and went by the house. And what he found must have been a very disturbing scene. He said the house was 90 degrees inside, that there was a foul stench. He found his brother having been murdered. His brother's body was bloated at this point. There was mottling on the arms, and there were maggots on the body. All of these are clues that the forensic pathologist could use to at least make an estimation of what the time of death is. When we talk about time of death, we talk about it in the sense that after you die, you're basically eaten from the inside out by bacteria, and you're eaten from the outside in by flies and their maggots. The flies were the key element here in this particular case. We're in an area, it depends on how you want to look at it, where it's either a rich and vibrant set of wetlands in Bertie County, or it's an insect-infested swamp in Bertie County. There are flies everywhere, and flies are very opportunistic. Once there is a dead body, they will lay their eggs very, very rapidly on the dead body to colonize it so that the maggots that grow from those eggs can eat the dead body, turn into pupae, which then turn into adult flies that can then reproduce. And this had happened in the case of Alan Jenkins, they had gotten into the larval stage. So the police here in Allander had a really difficult situation because they didn't have any obvious suspects to Alan Jenkins' murder. And they also didn't even know when he had died. And so, faced with a difficult situation, they called in the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation to help with the homicide investigation. And a man by the name of David Ransom was then sent out by NCSBI to lead the homicide investigation in this case. Ransom had one major advantage here, and that is the people of Allander. As I said, it's a small town. Everybody sees who's coming and going at all times, and this is no exception. So the question is, when was Alan Jenkins last seen alive was an important one for David Ransom. And he started talking to the neighbors. And the neighbors actually said, Mary Hunt, Willie Haggard, Ricky Odom, and others actually said they saw him between April 7th and April 8th. The body had been found on the 14th. So roughly a week beforehand. And that's consistent, roughly, with what was being seen on the body, where you'd seen the development of the maggots and the decomposition. The April 7th and 8th figures were pretty strong because the neighbors were aware of Jenkins' habit of having these loud parties and these neighbors, and they knew what was the last time that that had bothered them. And so they were very clear about, you know, when did they last see him mowing the lawn? When did they last see him at a party? They even, one of them even mentioned that they saw him at the Golden Peanut, which I don't believe is still open here in Allander, but there still is an old rusted out sign of the Golden Peanut on the street that leads into the stoplight over there. So the neighbor's testimony was actually quite definitive, probably the most definitive in the entire case. But there were other people who saw him about town. Like I said, he liked to have fish. And so he was seen by Benjamin Jenkins, Janelle Harris, and Larry Lake at what is called the Red Apple, which still is there. And near the next door to that was the Fish Hole, where he would go and buy fish. And they said they saw him there on the 10th of April. There was another group that saw him in nearby Ahoskie. Now, Ahoskie is not that big a town either, but it's way bigger than Allander, and it has a restaurant called the Golden Skillet, or at least it did have a restaurant called the Golden Skillet at that time, and the people who worked at the Golden Skillet said they saw him there on April 10th between like 5 and 6, which was consistent with what was with the Red Apple idea. So the idea being, like, he went to the Red Apple, maybe got himself some gas, got himself some fish, but then maybe he came home to put the fish in the refrigerator and then went back out to Ahoskie to have dinner at the Golden Skillet on the 10th of April. Later on, many of those witnesses who saw him about town would change their story when David Ransom challenged them and said, "Are you sure about the 10th? Do you know whether it was the 10th or was it the previous week that you may have seen him?" And many of them changed their story. Alan's brother, Sidney, said he saw Alan on the 8th of April. Another friend saw him on the 7th of April. And there was a lot of inconsistency in some of the around town kind of timing on these. Some of them changed their story over time when they were challenged by David Ransom, but the neighbors were the most consistent. They never really changed their view that they had seen Alan Jenkins alive around the 7th or 8th of April. So at this point, police must have believed that Alan Jenkins was murdered on around April 7th to April 10th, and then the body found April 14th. They didn't really, though, have a suspect in the murder. That changed when they interviewed two teenage girls, Crystal Morris and Shanna Hall. As far as we know, they are the only valid connection between Jenkins and Gell. Both Jenkins and Gell had this penchant for hanging out with underage teenage girls and giving them, you know, alcohol or whatever as a favor to them. And these two girls knew Alan Gell and they knew Alan Jenkins. they eventually came forward to the police and said, we saw the murder. We witnessed Alan Gell murdering Jenkins, with the motive being robbery. The idea being that Gell was accused of taking $400 from Jenkins and murdering him for that money. The timing issue, though, was a difficult one. And it's because around this time, Alan Gell himself was involved in an awful lot of criminal activity. And some people say that he was a one-man crime spree in the early part of April of 1995. So in April 2nd, he had been arrested for stealing a truck. And then he was let go. He then wound up, within a day or two of that, stealing another truck so that he could go up into Maryland and Virginia onto the Eastern Shore and buy drugs. By the time he got back on April 6th, or actually April 5th, the night of April 5th, Gell's mother told him that the police were looking for him. She said, stay at my house tonight, we'll go into the police station the next morning. And that's exactly what they did. He went into the police station the next morning, gave himself up for the second truck theft, and was in the county lockup for about 2 weeks after that, from April 6th to April 20th. As it turned out, after he was let out of the county lockup on the 20th of April, he then fled the state. Eventually was rearrested in Florida for stealing pizza down there, extradited back to North Carolina, and by that time these two teenage girls had implicated him in the Jenkins murder. Now, there was no evidence, no physical evidence, linking him to Jenkins or to the murder scene, but there were these two teenage girls who self-confessed to being accessories to the murder. And they also had a guy who was obviously desperate for money to do this drug buy and had all these other issues with respect to his involvement in criminal activity here in the area. So he was, in some ways, the perfect suspect. If he didn't have an alibi, he was already on death row at this point. So the key issue becomes, after Alan Gell is in the county lockup on April 6th, was Jenkins still alive? And there were as many as 17 witnesses who said he was still alive. Ransom goes back out, that investigator with the State Bureau of Investigation, goes back out, re-interviews all the witnesses, takes new statements that say either we don't know or maybe we saw him on the 3rd instead of the 10th, which is not uncommon for eyewitnesses to vary their testimony. When the trial came about, the defense asked the prosecution for any exculpatory information, and the prosecution said, well, we don't really have any. The prosecutors wound up getting sanctioned later for their failure to disclose the exculpatory evidence, especially the neighbors. The neighbors here in the area were completely disinterested in whether Alan Gell was guilty or anything else like that, and they were very familiar with Jenkins' comings and goings. And so their testimony was actually pretty ironclad throughout this time. There is evidence that at least for at least one of the neighbors, that Ransom actually changed that neighbor's report, saying she had said originally that she had seen him alive on the 7th or 8th, and in the report it was listed down as the 1st. And it's very possible that Ransom had changed that date, and she later came forward and said, what are you talking about? I never changed when I reported Jenkins being alive. So here's the setup. We have these 3 conflicting witness statements, but then we also have the science. Is the science of forensic pathology able to deconvolve these problems and actually come up with a real time of death for Alan Jenkins? The body went to the state medical examiner's office, to Dr. Gilliland, who was a well-respected forensic pathologist here in the eastern part of the state. And in her initial assessment, she said, I have some uncertainties because I don't know how hot it was, but I believe that he was murdered 7 to 10 days before the body was found. So the body was found at 3 o'clock on April 14th. And the day was very similar to a day like today. So the high that day was 64 degrees. The high today here in Allander is 67 degrees. A very, very pleasant day. But remember, inside the home it was 90 degrees because the heat had been left on. And so the heat of the day was warming that house during the day, and then the heat of the furnace was keeping it warm at night. And in fact, some of the intervening days had actually gone over 80 degrees as well. Gilliland made the determination that the body had been dead for 7 to 10 days when it had been found, which was a reasonable amount of uncertainty. And that's what she told the defense attorney when the defense attorney interviewed her. Ransom, then, the investigator, went back to her and said, there's a problem here because our suspect has an alibi for that time period, but we have him dead to rights. I mean, he's a serial criminal at this point. He was looking for money to buy drugs. We have 2 witnesses who have confessed to second-degree murder who said they saw him kill Jenkins. Why are you saying 7 to 10 days? And on that basis of context, even though it turns out it was bad context, she made the determination that Jenkins could have died 7 to 12 days, and that's how she testified during the trial for Alan Gell, much to the dismay of the defense attorney who expected 7 to 10 days. And that was Alan Gell's one chance at an alibi that fell through. Because he also didn't know, because the prosecutor hadn't disclosed, that there were exculpatory witness statements as well that related to the time of death, that put the time of death as late as, say, April 9th or even 10th for Alan Jenkins. So Alan Gell was then convicted of murdering Alan Jenkins. And this is where he had a weird bit of luck. He was sentenced to death. Now, you would think like, well, being sentenced to death generally isn't a lucky day for you. But in North Carolina at that time, it was a lucky day for him, because if you're convicted of something where you get sentenced to the death penalty, then you get the ability to review the entire case record. That means that he all of a sudden had access not just to the exculpatory information, but to the entirety of the information about the case, including all the different witness interviews, including up to 17 that could be interpreted as being exculpatory for him. The one problem then became, well, what about this time of death estimate? Dr. Gilliland had said, I don't really know what the temperature was inside the house that the body experienced, and so I have this great deal of uncertainty about when the time of death had really occurred. And that's basically how she testified in the trial. Meant of fly eggs and maggots is very closely dependent upon temperature. So there's a temperature where basically nothing will happen. Usually for a common fly, you'll have like, just a few degrees above freezing, where basically there will be no development. It's kind of frozen in its tracks. And there are temperatures that are too high as well. But if you have temperatures in the 50 to 60 to 80 to 85 degree range, the flies love that, and the larvae will grow and multiply relatively rapidly. This has been elucidated by some of the advances in forensic taphonomy, which is the science of body farms, basically, where they put dead bodies out and they see how they degrade over time. And they've developed the concept, actually since the 80s and 90s, of the idea of degree days and a species dependent kind of degree days. So some species will grow better at lower temperatures, some will grow better at higher temperatures, and things of that nature. This is when another problem occurred in the case, and that is that neither at the crime scene nor at the autopsy were maggots collected. And what this meant was that we don't know what species of fly it was that colonized the body. And as I said, some of these estimates are species dependent. What we believe is, and what the estimate that the defense team wound up taking on post-conviction was based on Calliphora vicina, which is basically a common fly. The one that you would see, the kind of fly you would see just about anywhere around here, and is by far the most likely fly to have colonized the body. And so the lawyers went to the people from the body farm, and they also got an estimate not only for the degree days here outside, but also inside the house, because that's where the body was. and it was actually much warmer inside the house than outside. On at least 5 occasions, they believe that the temperature exceeded 90 degrees inside the house, which would have accelerated the pupa development for that species. There is also a limit with respect to whether the maggots had gone on to the pupa stage. Eventually what happens with a fly is it goes from maggot to pupa to adult fly that then can reproduce. There were no casings found at the crime scene, and there was no development noted anywhere that the maggots had gone into the pupa stage. Based on the temperatures, if the murder had occurred as early as April 3rd, you would expect to at least see some level of pupa development, but that was not seen in the case of Alan Jenkins' body. As a result, they said, we think that the murder could not have occurred any earlier than roughly April 8th, roughly a week before the body was found. Dr. Gilliland then had 2 interesting things that happened. She changed again her estimate of time of death to agree with what the defense had brought forward post-conviction. She said, based on the new information about the temperature and the science, I agree that the body could not have been dead for as long as 12 days. And therefore I back off my 7 to 12 day estimate and go back to something closer to my original estimate of 7 to 10 days. She also did something that was interesting from the perspective of expert errors. When the newspaper came to her to interview her about the case, they gave her a broader set of the witness statements. And she said, I had never seen these before. I didn't know that there were witnesses who said that Jenkins was alive as late as the 8th or 9th of April. And you have all these statements. When 17 people say that you're still alive, that's a pretty strong estimate. And I would love to have known that, and I would have pulled that into my time of death estimate. The problem being is, like, that is not science, right? She allowed the contextual information given to her by Ransom from the State Bureau of Investigation to influence her scientific judgment. If she had merely said, well, you know, it's 7 to 10 days or 7 to 12 days, and I have a lot of uncertainties because of this variable and that variable, and you all have to work out the rest yourself, that was defensible. For her to come back and say, well, you know, I was relying on bad context with Ransom, and now I'm relying on good context because of what the newspaper is telling me about the witness statements, and therefore I'm reducing the window for time of death on that basis. That really is not a good way of doing the scientific estimate of postmortem interval. And she was allowing the contextual information, in this case, to unduly influence her. So Alan Gell's conviction was overturned in 2002 on the basis of the suppressed evidence from the other eyewitnesses that gave exculpatory statements. In 2004, he was actually retried and easily acquitted once those statements were brought into evidence, as well as this greater information about the time of death estimate. He wound up suing the state for his wrongful conviction, and there was a settlement of $4 million that was given to Gell as part of that lawsuit. And that's kind of expected, isn't it? When you're accused of and convicted of a capital crime that actually occurred while you were in custody in the county jail, that's clearly a miscarriage of justice. And therefore, Alan Gell was certainly deserving of that settlement. We are more concerned here in terms of like my concerns about what happened here with the expert. I made some emphasis here during the video about this issue of, you know, the body farm and the improved science and looking at the temperature record. But in the end, the uncertainties weren't narrowed that much by that extra science. The original estimate by Dr. Gilliland was perfectly good, 7 to 10 days, was based on science and was only compromised by the fact that she allowed for Ransom to give her this contextual information that was not reliable. And honestly, what you see is this dynamic between the police investigator and the forensic scientist all too often, where the police investigator, you know, basically is influencing the forensic scientist sometimes to give what was a biased estimate when the original basic, not context free, but free of the bad context analysis was not only acceptable, but was actually more reliable. It was because it was based only on the medical scientific data that the examiner had used. The examiner should not have allowed Ransom to influence her time of death estimate in the end. And although the science has improved, that lesson is timeless. It was true in 1995. It's true in 2023. Even with better science, if you're not willing to stick to the science, then you're going to be influenced to produce results that are unreliable. And that is the underlying lesson here for the Gell case. We talk a lot about contextual bias, but the issue here is more subtle. It's about the relationship between the expert, Dr. Gilliland, and the other expert, the detective in this case, who was giving her what wound up being unreliable information, and not allowing your expertise to be compromised by what you see that is irrelevant to that expertise. And that is a lesson I think we can all learn, not only if you're a forensic pathologist, but any kind of expert. So thank you for listening today. Please like, share, subscribe, visit experterrors.org to learn more about my work and other cases. I appreciate your support for my work by tuning into this video and partaking of some of the other work that I've done.